I was never really into celebrating Christmas, so spending Christmas Eve alone at home was just another day for me. No decorations, no twinkling lights, just my mom's old tree shoved into the corner of the living room, which I only set up out of obligation, not because I wanted to. It was pouring that night, one of those heavy December rains, and the constant drumming of the drops on the roof was almost relaxing. Everything was quiet, just me, a cheap bottle of wine, and a movie playing on the TV that I wasn't even really watching. I think it was around 11 p.m. when it all started. I heard a soft knock at the front door. Firm, but not too loud. Odd, because who knocks on your door in weather like that? I froze for a few seconds, thinking maybe I imagined it. But then the knock came again, louder this time. I got up, feeling a little uneasy, and went to the door, not opening it, just peeking through the peephole. There was a man standing there, soaked to the bone, wearing a heavy jacket with the hood pulled up. He looked uncomfortable in the rain, like he'd been out there for a while. He seemed to be in his mid-40s, scruffy beard, holding a phone that kept flashing like it was dying. My car broke down nearby. Mind if I come in just to call a tow truck? He shouted over the sound of the rain. There was something about his voice. It wasn't exactly wrong, but it wasn't right either. Not scared or desperate, but calculated, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I hesitated. I mean, I'm not heartless. It was Christmas Eve, and a guy soaking wet with a supposedly broken down car didn't seem that strange, but something about the whole thing made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he knocked, like he was sure I was home, even though there were no lights on or any sign of movement inside. Or maybe it was the fact that, despite him saying his car broke down nearby, I hadn't heard an engine or seen any headlights when I looked out the window earlier. Still, I decided to talk to him through the door without opening it. "Do you need help with something specific?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "I just need to call a tow truck, man. I'm freezing out here." Still suspicious, I told him I'd call a tow truck for him and asked which number he wanted me to dial. That's when he said something that made my stomach drop. "Any number's fine." "Who says that? If your car broke down, wouldn't you know the number for roadside assistance or at least someone to call?" I looked through the peephole again and he seemed nervous, glancing around like he was checking if someone else was watching. The rain was coming down harder, and that uneasy feeling, the kind you get when something just isn't right, started to creep up on me. He knocked again, harder this time. "Come on, man, just open the door. I won't take long. I'm just trying not to catch pneumonia out here." My mind was racing, flooded with 1,000 thoughts. I felt stupid for being so suspicious. I mean, who wouldn't help someone in a situation like that? But that little voice in the back of my head, the one that only speaks up when something's wrong, kept telling me not to open the door. I decided to check the living room window, trying to see if his broken down car was actually out there. I pulled the curtain back just a bit, enough to sneak a look. Nothing, no car parked on the street, not even near my driveway. The only thing outside was the heavy rain and darkness broken by the faint glow of the streetlight. My heart started pounding. I went back to the door and asked again, trying to sound calm, "Where did you say your car broke down?" He took longer than he should have to respond. "Uh, over there, around the curve." That's when I realized he had changed his story. Before, he said his car broke down nearby, but now it was around the curve. And worse, the curve was a good 300 meters from my house. It didn't make sense for him to come all the way here through a storm when there were other houses closer. That's when I really started to feel like things were spiraling out of control. Then the knocking on the door changed. It wasn't a polite request anymore. It was aggressive, like he was trying to force his way in. I took a step back, my heart pounding so hard I thought he might hear it from outside. He shouted again, but this time his voice was different. It wasn't desperate anymore. It was cold, almost commanding. "You're going to open this door." In that moment, my only thought was to lock everything. Even though the door was already locked, I ran to check the windows, the back door, any possible way he could get in. The sound of the rain made everything feel more surreal, the constant drumming drowning out any other noises. While I did this, he kept pounding on the door, harder now, as if he was trying to break it down. But what really froze me in place was the sound that came next. It wasn't knocking anymore. It was something that sounded like nails scratching against the wood, slow and deliberate, like he wanted to scare me on purpose. And it worked. I went back to the front door, trying to look through the peephole again, but now I couldn't see anything. He had either stepped back or was hiding, which somehow made it worse. I grabbed my phone and thought about calling the police, but then I realized he had stopped making any noise. The silence was so sudden, it felt like the whole house was holding its breath with me. Did he leave? I thought, trying to convince myself. But before I could finish that thought, I heard something even worse. Footsteps. Not at the front of the house, but on the side, near the kitchen window. He was trying to go around. I hurried to the kitchen, moving as quietly as I could, and peeked through the gap in the curtains. There he was, standing close to the window, still wearing his hood. But now, without the cover of rain and distance, I could see something was off. He didn't look wet. I mean, it was pouring outside, and anyone would have been soaked in seconds. But his jacket wasn't dripping, and the water running off him looked wrong, like it was evaporating before it hit the ground. He was staring directly at the window like he knew I was there, even though there was no way he could see me. By now, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I typed in the number for the police, but before I could press call, he stepped back 2 paces and pointed directly at me. That was all it took for me to drop the curtain and bolt to my bedroom. I locked the door and started piling furniture in front of it, scrambling to think of anything I could use as a weapon. My mind was spinning. None of this made sense. Who was this guy? What did he want? I wondered if it was some kind of robbery, but he hadn't tried to break in, at least not yet. And how did he seem to know exactly where I was inside the house? When I finally worked up the courage to peek out the bedroom window to make sure he was still outside, the worst thing happened. He wasn't there anymore. My stomach dropped. He wasn't in the yard anymore, and with the heavy rain drowning out nearly every other sound, I couldn't tell if he'd left or gotten inside. I stood there frozen, clutching my phone, straining to hear anything that might give me a clue. That's when I heard it, a soft creak coming from downstairs. It was the kind of sound floorboards make when someone steps on them, and I knew there was no wind or animal that could have caused it. He was inside my house. Panic set in, and I called the police, whispering as quietly as I could while explaining what was happening. They said they'd send a unit, but because of the storm, it might take some time. I just needed to stay safe. Easier said than done. And then I heard the thing that scared me the most that night. A whistle. It was coming from downstairs, slow and melodic, almost like a lullaby. Who the hell breaks into someone's house and starts whistling? I stood there paralyzed, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was like he knew I was upstairs and was toying with me. I tried convincing myself he didn't know exactly where I was, but the whistling got louder, closer, like he was climbing the stairs, step by step. My body locked up, and my breathing was so shallow I started feeling lightheaded. Then the whistling stopped. Right outside the bedroom door, I didn't move a muscle, gripping my phone so tightly my hands ached. The silence returned, but not the kind that calms you. It was heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that feels like it's bracing for something terrible. I knew he was right there, standing on the other side of the door, but he wasn't making a sound. Seconds dragged on like hours until I heard a faint knock-knock on the door. It wasn't violent, it was casual, almost polite, like someone kindly asking permission to come in. My heart felt like it was about to explode out of my chest. He was messing with me, and I knew it, but I couldn't do anything. Then, for the first time since he showed up, he spoke again, in that calm, eerily measured voice. "You can't hide forever." That snapped me out of it. I grabbed a heavy lamp off the nightstand, ready to defend myself if he managed to get in. That's when the door handle started to jiggle, slowly at first, like he was testing to see if I'd forgotten to lock it. Thankfully, in my panic, I turned the key, but that seemed to make him more determined. He started shaking the handle harder, the sound of metal clanging against the frame echoing in the room. I was yelling at him to leave, but he didn't answer. He just kept pushing, more forcefully each time. And then, like something out of a nightmare, everything stopped. The handle, the noises, even the sound of the rain outside seemed to fade into the background. I looked around, clutching the lamp like my life depended on it, and the silence was absolute. I stood there, frozen, straining to hear anything that might give away where he was. The silence felt wrong, almost unnatural. Finally, I mustered up the courage to approach the bedroom door. I pressed my ear against it, praying not to hear anything. And that's exactly what happened. Nothing. No footsteps, no creaking floorboards, not even that strange whistling. It was like the house was completely empty. I decided I had to check. With my phone in one hand and the lamp in the other, I unlocked the door and slowly cracked it open, hoping I wouldn't find him standing there. The hallway was empty. I stepped out carefully, trying not to make a sound, each step echoing in the oppressive quiet. When I reached the top of the stairs, I peered down. Again, nothing. Was he gone? But how? The front door was still locked, and so were all the windows. I decided to go downstairs and make sure, every step feeling like it took an eternity. When I reached the ground floor, everything looked the same. The door was shut, no signs of forced entry, nothing out of place. Even the rain outside had softened to a light drizzle. Summoning all my courage, I looked out the living room window. The street was empty. There was no sign of him or any car. It was like everything had gone back to normal. But then as I stood there staring out the window, I noticed something. Right in the middle of the fogged-up glass was a handprint, a large handprint, as if someone had just pressed their palm against it. The sight of that handprint froze me in place. I knew it hadn't been there before. It was big, almost unnaturally large, like it belonged to someone taller or bigger than normal. My heart started racing again, and I instinctively stepped back, clutching the phone and the lamp tighter. I knew I couldn't just stand there anymore. I ran to the front door, unlocked it, and swung it open, expecting to see something, muddy footprints maybe, or even the car he claimed had broken down. But there was nothing. The street was completely empty, and the rain had almost stopped, leaving only puddles scattered across the pavement. I went back inside, locking the door behind me again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That handprint on the window felt like it was watching me, a chilling reminder that he'd been closer than I ever wanted to admit. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with every light in the house on, waiting for the police to arrive. When they finally did, they looked around but didn't find anything unusual. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence at all. One of the officers even suggested that maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but I knew the truth. That handprint on the window was still there, a silent testament to what had happened. I wiped it off the next day, but I never felt safe in that house again. To this day, every time it rains on Christmas, I find myself waiting, listening for that knock at the door.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I've never been a fan of spending Christmas away from home, but that year was an exception. My parents insisted we needed to visit my aunt and uncle, who lived in a small town, the kind where everybody knows each other. I was 16, and honestly, all I wanted was to stay in my room playing video games. But there I was, stuck in their house, surrounded by Christmas decorations that looked like they were straight out of the 80s, with a constant smell of burnt cookies wafting in from the kitchen. My little brother, Luke, who was 8, seemed to love the festive vibe and the freedom to run around their huge backyard. At first, everything seemed normal, but pretty soon, I started feeling this weird unease that I couldn't shake. It had to do with the neighbor, Mr. Clark, as everyone called him. He showed up at the fence on the first day, waving and holding a tin of cookies like some out-of-shape Santa Claus. My aunt and parents laughed, saying he was just the sweetest guy. He seemed overly friendly from the start, especially with Luke. At first, I thought I was just overreacting, but as the days went by, he always seemed to find some excuse to be around. He was constantly hovering whenever Luke was in the backyard, calling him over to check out something cool or asking him random questions about what he liked. Luke, of course, thought it was fun, but something about it gave me chills. I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid, but I decided to keep an eye on him. On Christmas Eve, while everyone was busy decorating the house and prepping for dinner, I realized Luke wasn't around. I went to the backyard, and of course, there he was at the fence, talking to Mr. Clark. This time, the neighbor was showing him some old toy, a vintage die-cast car, the kind with super intricate details. He said he collected them and told Luke he could come over to see the rest of his collection. My stomach dropped. He wasn't saying anything outright creepy, but the way he spoke felt insidious, like he was trying to lower Luke's guard. I walked over and called my brother back inside, and Mr. Clark gave me a look I'll never forget. It wasn't angry, but something more subtle, like I just messed up his plans. I told my mom what I saw, but she brushed it off, saying I was being paranoid and that Mr. Clark was just a nice neighbor trying to be friendly. I wanted to believe her, but that night something happened that made me feel on edge. While everyone was in the living room opening presents and listening to Christmas music, I noticed that The lights in Mr. Clark's house were off, but there was a silhouette standing in the window, staring directly at our backyard. It was like he was waiting for something, or someone. A shiver ran down my spine, and I got up to make sure Luke was still around. He was, but my gut told me something wasn't right. The rest of the night dragged on, and I couldn't relax for a second. Christmas morning came, and Luke was more excited than ever, running around the house with his new toys. I tried to shake off the weirdness from the night before, but it kept gnawing at me. Then I noticed something strange. On the kitchen table near the back door, there was an envelope with no name or return address. Inside was a handwritten note that said, "For Luke, with love." That was it. No signature, no clue who it was from. I thought it was weird as hell, especially since no one knew where it came from. I showed it to my mom, but she just laughed, saying it was probably some goofy gesture from Mr. Clark. "He always does stuff like this at Christmas," she said, brushing it off. I was starting to hate how everyone seemed to downplay his behavior. Later that day, Luke disappeared again. I went straight to the backyard, but this time he wasn't near the fence. My heart started racing. I looked around and noticed the side gate was slightly open. Panic set in. I ran outside, shouting his name, but all I heard was the sound of something falling near Mr. Clark's house. I ran in that direction, and just as I got close to his door, Luke came running out. He was pale, silent, and frozen with fear. He wasn't crying, but the look on his face made my blood run cold. When I asked him what happened, he just shook his head and pulled me toward our house. That's when Mr. Clark stepped out onto his porch, wearing the same friendly smile as always. But now, it felt completely wrong. He casually said, "Merry Christmas." Like nothing had happened. Luke refused to talk about it, which only made it more terrifying. Once we got back inside, I took Luke straight to the bedroom and pressed him to tell me what had happened. At first, he wouldn't say anything, but after a lot of coaxing, he finally opened up. He said Mr. Clark had invited him inside to see a special present he had in the basement. According to Luke, the neighbor kept insisting it was something he'd absolutely love. But as they started going down the stairs, Luke said he got this overwhelming feeling of fear. He described the basement as dark and smelling weird, like damp wood and something old. Before he could explain more, he broke down crying and kept repeating that I didn't want to go back there. I was at a loss. My first instinct was to tell my parents, but considering how they'd been brushing everything off, I doubted they'd take me seriously. I decided to keep an eye on that house for the rest of the day. Every time I passed the living room window, I glanced outside, but everything seemed quiet. That was until late afternoon when something caught my attention. The gate to Mr. Clark's yard was open, and there were marks on the ground that looked like something had been dragged. My stomach churned with a dread I couldn't shake. I knew nobody would believe me, so I decided to take a walk around the block to clear my head and get a different view of his house. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing, a large black bag near the fence, as if it was waiting to be picked up. There was something inside it, something heavy, like my stomach flipped, but I couldn't look away. I went back to the house feeling like something terrible was happening, but I didn't have the nerve to confront Mr. Clark alone. Instead, I told my uncle, who was the most level-headed person in the family. When I explained everything, the note, Luke's story, the black bag, he gave me a serious look and said he'd check it out. He wasn't the type to believe in wild tales, but just in case, he grabbed a flashlight and went outside with me. When we got to Mr. Clark's gate, the black bag was still there. But before my uncle could get close, Mr. Clark appeared on his porch. "Need something?" he asked, that insufferable smile plastered across his face. My uncle played it cool, saying we were just out for a walk, but the way Mr. Clark looked at us made me want to run back inside. That night, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Luke was still shaken and refused to leave my side. I decided to sleep in his room just to make sure he wasn't alone. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something outside, leaves crunching underfoot. My heart pounded as I carefully peeked out the window. There he was, Mr. Clark, standing in my aunt and uncle's backyard, staring directly at the window of the room where we were. He didn't move. He just stood there completely still, like he was waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat. Before I could do anything, he slowly turned and walked back toward his house, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't sleep a second after that. I was too afraid to even blink. The next morning, my mom noticed how exhausted I was and asked what had happened. When I told her about Mr. Clark being in the backyard during the night, she finally started to take me seriously. My uncle decided it was time to talk to the neighbors about his behavior. But when we went to Mr. Clark's house that morning, something was off. The windows were shut, and the place looked abandoned, like no one had been there for days. The black bag near the gate was gone. My uncle knocked on the door several times, even calling out for Clark, but there was no response. It was as if the man had vanished overnight. Still, I couldn't get what I'd seen out of my head. Later that day, Luke finally opened up more about what happened, and he said that in the basement, he'd seen a bunch of creepy stuff, broken toys, photos of kids, and, most unsettling, a small chair with ropes tied around it, like it had been used to restrain someone. He didn't fully understand what it was, but it scared him enough to make him run. My mom was horrified and decided we needed to head back home that same day. While we were packing, my aunt tried calling the police to report the situation, but there wasn't much to say beyond suspicious behavior. Without concrete evidence, the call didn't lead anywhere. We left my aunt and uncle's house that evening, and the drive home was unusually quiet. Luke seemed calmer, but I couldn't stop thinking about the basement, or the way Mr. Clark had stared at our house. My mom kept saying we needed to put it behind us and focus on the rest of the holidays, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The next day, my aunt called to tell us the police had finally gone to Clark's house. When they got inside, they said it was empty, but what they found shocked everyone. There were items that belonged to other kids in the neighborhood and a locked room that seemed like some sort of bizarre shrine filled with old photos and toys. The strangest part, no one had any idea where Mr. Clark had gone. It was like he had disappeared into thin air. My aunt mentioned that once the news got out, other families in the neighborhood started coming forward about odd encounters with him over the years. But until now, no one had ever done anything about it. My mom was clearly shaken and avoided talking about it in front of Luke. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about how different things might have been if I hadn't been paying attention that first day. Sometimes, Luke still wakes up in the middle of the night saying he has nightmares about the basement. He doesn't talk about what he saw down there anymore, and I don't press him. Some things, I guess, are better left alone. After we got home, I did my best to move on, but it felt like that Christmas left a scar on our family. Luke stopped playing alone in the backyard and became afraid of being around strangers, something that had never been an issue before. I tried to get back to normal, but there were still nights when I'd wake up with the image of Mr. Clark standing in our yard, staring at the window. Every now and then, I'd think about how everyone at my aunt's house thought he was just a good neighbor. It made me wonder how many other families might have ignored similar warning signs until it was too late. The last I heard about Mr. Clark was months later, when my aunt mentioned that no one ever saw him again. The house was sold to another family, and according to her, the police closed the case due to a lack of concrete evidence. It was as if he had erased all traces of himself. To this day, I think about what could have happened if Luke had stayed in that house longer, or if no one had noticed something was wrong. Like, some things just don't have an explanation, but the feeling that he's still out there somewhere has never left me. Every Christmas, that unease comes back, and I can't help but glance out the window just to make sure.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I don't even know where to start with this, but I need to get it off my chest. It happened last Christmas, and to this day, I can't make it through this time of year without getting chills down my spine. On Christmas morning, my husband and I woke up excited, as usual. We don't have kids, but we keep some fun traditions. Putting up the tree, leaving out cookies and milk the night before, just for the heck of it. I was sure the day would be peaceful, but everything changed the moment I went downstairs to the living room. One of the cookies we left out had a bite taken out of it, and the glass of milk had fingerprints, ones that definitely weren't ours. I thought it was odd, but I joked that maybe Santa came by. My husband laughed, but something in the air felt different. The smell, the vibe. It was like the house didn't belong to us anymore. As we walked around the house, I started noticing more weird stuff. The blanket from the couch was on the floor, folded like someone had been wrapped up in it. That was strange because we never used that blanket, especially not in the living room. When I went to the kitchen, I noticed the fridge door was slightly open. It looked like someone had been rummaging inside because things were out of place. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, maybe forgetting things from the night before. But the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. My husband tried to calm me down, but I could see he was starting to feel uneasy too. This wasn't just a coincidence. Something had happened while we were asleep. We decided to check the rest of the house just to make sure everything was okay. The bedrooms looked fine, but what really got me was the door to the garage. It was unlocked. That's when the panic really set in. I was 100% sure we'd locked it the night before. My husband, trying to keep me from freaking out even more, suggested maybe we'd just forgotten. But when we opened the door and turned on the light, things got so much worse. In the corner of the garage, near some toolboxes we rarely touch, there was a dirty blanket and a plastic bag with scraps of food. It looked like someone had been living there, and for a while. My eyes locked onto something even more disturbing. One of our kitchen mugs, the kind that should never leave the house, was sitting there with fresh coffee stains on the rim. I started shaking, but my husband was doing his best to stay calm. He walked over to the corner and carefully checked out the items. Along with the blanket and the food bag, there was a small notebook, one of those cheap ones for jotting things down. I shouldn't have opened it, but my curiosity got the best of me. When I did, my blood ran cold. It was full of scribbles, random words, what looked like maps or blueprints of our house, and worst of all, notes that chilled me to my core. She cooks at 6 p.m. He likes light beer. They go to bed at 11 p.m. It was like someone had been watching us for weeks, maybe even months. I slammed the notebook shut so hard I almost ripped the pages. In that moment, all my worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't in my head. Someone had been invading our space, studying our every move. We didn't know what to do. It was Christmas, and calling the police felt surreal. But how could we go about our day pretending nothing had happened? My husband suggested we check around the property to make sure no one was still there before deciding our next move. We grabbed our phones, and he picked up a baseball bat he kept around from his old playing days. My heart was pounding as we opened the back door. The garage had a small side door that led outside, but it was locked from the inside, meaning if someone had left, it could only have been through the front door or a window. We checked every entry point, and even though everything seemed secure, it was impossible to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Back in the garage, my husband noticed something I hadn't seen before: a stack of empty soda cans neatly piled next to the blanket. They weren't ours. We started gathering the things we didn't recognize, like puzzle pieces we were trying to put together. That's when it hit us. The person wasn't just hiding. They were comfortable, like they'd made a home there. There was an old bag with dirty clothes inside, but nothing that gave us a clear idea of who this person might be. The only personal item was a wallet with ID cards, but the photos were scratched out, almost as if they wanted to erase their identity. With every new discovery, the sense of violation grew. This wasn't just a stranger. It was someone who had studied us, someone who knew everything about our lives. After a while, my husband decided to step out of the garage and call the police. He said he didn't want to wait in there, but I knew he was just as scared as I was. I stayed in the living room, staring at the garage door, wondering how we had missed all the signs that someone had been living there. For a brief moment, I felt shame. Could this person have just been looking for shelter? But then I remembered the notebook, the scribbles, and the way everything was arranged. It sent chills down my spine. This wasn't just about needing a place to stay. It felt like they wanted something more. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It was faint, like something being dragged across the floor, and it was coming from the garage. My heart started racing. My husband was outside, and I was alone in the house. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I slowly approached the garage door, phone in one hand and knife in the other. My breathing was so loud it felt like it was echoing through the house. I tried to listen for any more noises, but everything had gone eerily quiet. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The light in the garage, which we'd left on, was now off. My husband was still outside, and the police hadn't arrived yet. Whatever, or whoever was in there, had turned off the light. My instincts told me to run, but I felt trapped between the fear of confronting whatever it was and the thought of letting it stay. With a trembling hand, I turned the doorknob slowly, cracking the door open just enough to peek inside. The darkness on the other side felt suffocating. Then, something darted past the opening, fast, like a shadow. I screamed and slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. My husband heard my scream and ran inside. He found me pressed against the wall, too shaken to speak. All I could do was point at the garage door. He grabbed the bat he'd left in the hallway and tried to open the door to the garage, but now it was locked, from the inside. That made no sense. How could someone have locked it again? We both stood there, staring at the door, when we heard heavy footsteps on the other side. It was deliberate, like whoever was in there wanted us to know they were still there. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving an unnerving silence. My husband took my hand and whispered that the police were on their way. But in that moment, it didn't feel like enough. Whoever was in there had broken into our home, touched our belongings, and now they were trapped, or worse, still watching us. When the police arrived, we explained everything that had happened. 2 officers entered the house and began inspecting the garage. My husband and I stayed in the living room, watching as they worked on opening the locked door. One of them had to force it open since no one inside responded. When they finally got it open, the garage was empty. There was no sign of anyone, but all the items we had found earlier were still there. The blanket, the bag, the stack of soda cans, and the notebook with the disturbing notes. One of the officers gave us a serious look and asked if we were sure someone had been there. My husband confirmed, describing the noises and the shadow I had seen. But the officers looked skeptical, like they thought we were exaggerating or imagining things. As they searched the garage, one of them noticed something we hadn't seen before. There were dirty handprints on the ceiling, as if someone had been hanging or climbing up there. And worse, the prints led to a small opening to the attic, a space we didn't even know existed. When the officer shone his flashlight up there, everyone went quiet. It was hard to see much, but there were signs that something, or someone, had been through there recently. The officers decided to investigate further, climbing up to check the attic. My husband and I stayed outside the garage, waiting anxiously. After a few minutes, one of the officers came back down with a strange expression. He said there was no one up there, but showed us what they had found. More hidden items, including food wrappers, an old radio, and a piece of paper with what looked like a drawing of a face. We didn't recognize the face, but just looking at it made us feel uneasy. Once the officers finished inspecting the attic, they told us it was likely that a homeless person had been using the space for shelter and had already left. But their explanation didn't sit right with us. The noises, the handprints, the door locking itself, none of it felt like something someone would just leave behind while moving on. The police collected the items as evidence, including the notebook and the piece of paper with the face. They assured us they would send a forensics team to analyze everything, but deep down, I had little faith that it would lead to any real answers. After the police left, the house didn't feel the same anymore. Every sound, every shadow felt like a reminder that someone had been there watching us. My husband tried to comfort me, saying that everything was under control, but I could see in his face that he was just as shaken as I was. That night, we slept with all the lights on and the baseball bat next to the bed. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't fall asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone crawling through the attic or standing in the garage watching us sleep. Around 3 a.m, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It was faint, like the sound of something metallic hitting the floor. My husband heard it too and went to check. He came back saying there was nothing there, but his face was pale and he seemed more shaken than before. We didn't say anything, but we both knew something was still wrong. It wasn't until the next morning that we discovered the final piece of this unsettling puzzle. The same mug from our kitchen, the one we'd found in the garage, was back on the kitchen counter. Spotless, as if someone had cleaned it and placed it there on purpose. That last detail, the mug, completely unraveled me. My husband and I were sure the police had taken it as evidence along with everything else. It made no sense for it to be back in the kitchen, and even worse, perfectly clean, with no signs of use. It felt like a message, as if someone wanted to show us they were still around, that they could come and go whenever they wanted. We couldn't stay in the house that day. We called some friends and spent the rest of Christmas at their place, trying to act like everything was fine. But inside I was terrified. That night I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us. My husband tried to keep up the appearance that nothing had happened, but I could tell he was just as scared. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. After Christmas, we decided to move. It didn't happen immediately, but no explanation we got felt satisfactory. The police never found anyone, and the items they took didn't lead to anything. To this day, we still don't know who that person was, how they managed to watch us for so long without us noticing, or why they left behind those disturbing clues. Sometimes I tell myself it was just a homeless person, someone desperate for shelter. But other times I feel like there was something far more sinister about the whole situation. What scares me the most is that even after moving, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. It's as if whatever it was didn't stay behind, as if that person or whatever they were is still out there, waiting. And the mug, I never wanted to see it again. I just hope I never have to go through anything like this ever again.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.